Hello everybody, welcome to the Introduction to Philosophy web video series. This is the introduction to Module 5 and the wrap-up of Module 4, which we will talk about first. So the concept of personal identity is clearly an interesting one. I think we had a really great time on the discussion board this week talking about the various, the ins and outs of that issue. First, the question, of course, is, what makes us who we are? What makes me the same me today that I was 5 minutes ago or 5 years ago? Memory is, a consideration, but of course, you get, problems when you start talking about people with amnesia or Alzheimer's or things like that. Other considerations are the same matter, but then if the same matter that makes me up is makes me me over time, makes me persist as an individual over time, what about drastic changes to that matter? Like I lose a leg or an arm, and the implication is made that I am the I, when I refer to I, is fundamentally different today than it was 5 years ago. I don't know if it is. I am still the same me, even when I'm losing a hand or a limb or something. And the third option, of course, is a soul, which makes me me, persisting throughout time. That's a little bit of a tidier solution, but we have less evidence for its existence, or at least the problems associated with arguing for it are a little bit greater. So, as it pertains to zombies, of course, always an interesting discussion. I think we did a really good job on the discussion board sort of showing how what makes us, this concept of self-awareness, of the ability to have introspection, and not only to actively be self-aware, but also the ability, it's not even an ability really, it's the idea that anytime we're doing anything, anytime we're perceiving anything, there's always this latent foundational perception that we might not even be consciously aware of, that we are a we. I am an I. And when I see my phone, I'm looking at my phone, even if I'm just playing Candy Crush or whatever you like to play, there is a tacit underlying assumption that the phone is different than you, that I am not my phone. I am me and the phone is my phone. And that tacit assumption, in fact, makes perception possible. I sort of got to this idea in some of my responses to you guys this week, but it's not something that we perceive. We don't look at ourselves and say, "Oh, I am an individual." Sometimes we can do that, but that's not really what we mean by self-awareness. What we mean by self-awareness is this sort of subjective, what we say in philosophy, this phenomenological, this experiential kind of understanding of us as individuals that isn't something that's perceived, but it's that which makes perception even possible. It makes possible us recognizing other things as other than ourselves. And that's the kind of thing that, say, a robot, or in my example that I gave to somebody over in the discussion board, was that of a camera. That our eyes work like cameras. Our eyes and our brains work just like camera lenses and central processing units in your Nikon or your Canon or your digital point and shoot. The difference is that a camera doesn't know that it's seeing, and a camera doesn't know that it is a separate entity from that which it takes pictures of, except we do. We know. Implicit in our seeing this or that, I'm looking around the room, is the idea that we are not those things, and yet we are a we. And on the assumption, of course, that a zombie doesn't have that faculty, we reduce it really to nothing more than an organic robot. And I think it's safe to say that a robot doesn't have personhood in the way that we think we do. And of course, that's another interesting distinction too, the idea that personhood is different than humanity. I mean, biological humanity. When we talk about, oh, it's our humanity, yeah, we mean who we are as people. But the question, are zombies human? Of course they are. They were human, and now, maybe they're still human, at least biologically, or maybe they're not even biologically human anymore. But the question is not whether or not they're human beings, but whether or not they are human persons. And I think making the distinction between a human being and a human person is extremely difficult in discussions about personal identity, because we saw in many places that the distinction can be very relevant in the discussion board. So anyway, really great job on that. This week, coming up, we're going to be talking about human freedom. Now, this is a really interesting topic, and I'm going to give you a little dilemma in a second that I want you to think about. But you know, the question of human freedom is incredibly relevant. It's immensely important. Imagine a world in which you're not free, and I don't mean not free in the sense that you're in jail. I mean that you don't have the faculty of choice. You don't have freedom of the will. You're not a free agent. So, for example, a robot that's programmed to do certain things is not free. Imagine if you don't have free choice. So it's not so much freedom from bondage, but freedom in the sense of freedom of your own will to make decisions. So obviously, if we don't have that, morality goes out the window, meaning and relationships go out the window. All kinds of things that we hold dear, that freedom of the will is sort of a pretext to having, are gone, right? It's a really important philosophical question, whether or not we truly have human freedom. And right now, as a fun exercise, I'm going to give you an argument that says that we don't have it, that human beings are not free, and I'm going to prove it to you right here. And I challenge you to give me your best shot and to prove me wrong here, okay? Here we go. God either exists or God does not exist. Those are the two options we have. There's nothing around that. There's nothing other that we can claim. God either exists or God doesn't exist. If God exists, then you have no freedom. And if God doesn't exist, then you have no freedom. Either way, you've got no freedom. Here's why. Okay. If God exists, then that means that God has, in the sense of the classically conceived notion of the Christian, the Judeo-Christian and Islamic God of the West, if that God exists, that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, all these things that they say that God is. But I'm interested in the all-knowing part. God, being outside of time, knows not only what has transpired and what is transpiring, but also what will transpire. It is widely accepted in theological circles and some philosophical circles that God's knowledge pertains to the future events as well as past and present events. So, and of course we also know that God can never be wrong because God is perfect by definition. So, if God exists, then God knows the future and God can't be wrong about it. So, if God knows the future and can't be wrong about it, how can you be free to do what you quote-unquote will do in the future? For example, let's say you're going to have a turkey sandwich for lunch. Is that action free? According to, on this position, if God knows that you're going to have a turkey sandwich and God can't be wrong about the fact that you're going to have a turkey sandwich, then that action can't be free because you couldn't do otherwise, right? And somebody could say, oh, what if, the action is free, and it's just that God knows that my action is free, and knows it because he's a perfect observer. He's not making me have a turkey sandwich. He gave me free will. And I'm choosing to have the turkey sandwich, and he knows about it, even though he can't be wrong. I'm still free. The question is, it's not that he knows it as you're choosing or after you've chosen, but he knows that you're going to have the turkey sandwich eons ago, before you're even born. It seems that your future is laid out in the mind of God since the inception of creation. So if that's the case, how can any of your decisions be free? If God knows what you're going to do and you can't not do it because God can't be wrong. So let's back up. If God exists, then you have no freedom. What about if God doesn't exist? Well, if God doesn't exist, then that means that what you are, what all things are is entirely material and has arisen as a result of biological evolution, which I should note, even if God exists, I'm sure that we've all arisen by biological evolution. But if God doesn't exist, then we've arisen merely or only by biological evolution. And given that reality, the materialist view of the universe is probably true, that all we are is hunks of matter, no souls, nothing special about us, nothing extra. We're just highly complicated organic clumps of organic matter. That's what we are. Now, if that's the case, there is no mind, there is no spirit, there is no soul, there's only brains. And brains are subject to the laws of physics, just like everything else in the world. Every time you make a choice, say to eat that turkey sandwich, something is going on in your brain. Something is firing. Some kind of synapses are firing, and you're making a decision. That's what we call, you're choosing to have a turkey sandwich. Well, that choice corresponds to a brain state that's going on in your brain, a material state of your brain where you want a turkey sandwich. Well, that state could only have arisen in response to a previous brain state. Okay, and that previous brain state could only have arisen in response to a previous and a previous and a previous, and you can keep on going back until you're born. This means that all of your choices, since you've been a baby, have been the product of the laws of physics being imposed on the motions of molecules inside your brain. So certain things are firing off each other, little chemicals, little proteins, boom, 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 everything happens. It all happens according to physical determinism, according to causality and the rules of cause and effect. So in a sense, if God doesn't exist and you're just a material being with nothing special about you, it's not divine foreknowledge that determines the events of your future, but rather the laws of physics and the laws of nature. So if we step back and we say, we could make an analogy with a roll of the dice or the flip of the coin. Every time you flip a coin, even though we use it as a measure for a random event, it's not random. If we knew everything about that coin flip physically, and we knew everything about the roll of a dice physically, we could perfectly predict how they're going to come up every single time. And if we rewound reality to right before the dice throw or right before the coin flip, and reality looked the same, down to the very last atom, down to the very last subatomic particle, the results of the dice throw and the results of the coin flip would always be the same when we hit the play button. This is what it means to have causal determinism in the laws of physics being imposed in a closed system. And your brain is part of that system. So the argument here is that you are the result of a deterministic chain of causal events, of cause and effect, that has determined the nature of the events of your life since you were born and since the Big Bang. You can't make any other decisions than the ones you're making because choice is an illusion, and all that really exists is the motions of molecules obeying the laws of physics inside your brain. So there you have it. If God exists and knows the future, then you have no freedom. If God doesn't exist, then you have no soul, and thus are a material being with, again, no freedom. And as we know, God either exists or God doesn't exist, so it seems that you either have no freedom or you have no freedom. How do we get out of this mess? Perhaps we will find out in the discussion board this week. Remember, your Module 5 prospectus is due, and I very much look forward to discussing these issues with you as the week moves on. Good luck.